Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otap, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habarigani, this is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, November 20th, 2022. Thank you to all who donated during our recent fund drive. Our program for this liberated hour starts in 1917 African Americans in World War I to the 1970s Death Squads in Apartheid South Africa. We begin with our African Drumbeat historical calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Mark Ellis, senior lecturer of history at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, and author of the book Race, War, and Surveillance, African Americans and the United States Government During World War I. Then, Dr. Horne interviews Robin Binckes, author of the book Vlakplaas, Apartheid Death Squads, 1979 to 1994, History of Terror. Our music clip mix includes MOK, Zap Mama, Miles Davis, Prison Radio. So sit back, tell a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Molweni Mawetu. This is Sister Luyanda Koboga with this week's African Drumbeat historical calendar. November 23rd, 1958, President Nkrumah of Ghana and Sékou Touré, Prime Minister of Guinea, unite the two nations to form the nucleus of the United States of Africa. President Modibo Keïta of Mali later joins the union, which is the fundamental objective of Pan-Africanism. Once Africa is united with a central government, language, economy, military, and foreign policy, African people, black people throughout Africa and the diaspora, including the United States, will have a national homeland and a base to demand and implement the elimination of racism, sexism, and class exploitation. November 23rd, 1909, tens of thousands of workers, mostly women, no longer willing to accept meager wages and degrading working conditions, went on strike against the garment industry in New York City. November 24th, 1965, the United States installs Mobutu as the neo-colonial puppet head of the Congo. Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected head of the Congo, was assassinated by a CIA-backed coup d'etat. Dominican Republic female leaders were executed. Las Hermanas Maria Teresa, Minerva, and Patria, leaders against the U.S.-installed Trujillo dictatorship. All three were members of the June 14th movement, which led the mass movement against Trujillo. November 26, 1883, Sister Sojourner Truth, African abolitionist, human rights crusader, committed to ending class, racial, and gender oppression. In 1827, at the age of 30, she ran away from the slave plantation, dropped her slave name, Isabella Baumfree, and claimed her own name, Sojourner Truth, in response to what she described as a command from God to become a preacher and activist against slavery. November 27th, 1853, Lucy Parson, revolutionary anarchist born a slave of Mexican, Creek, and African ancestry, fled from Texas and became a founder of the International Working People's Association, a revolutionary labor organization which led the struggle from 10 to 14 hours workdays to 8-hour workdays. She led numerous marches against the rich in the continued struggle for the redistribution of social wealth. November 28, 1960, Mauritania of Africa becomes independent. November 29, 1947, the United Nations made a decision to partition Palestine. As a result, every November 29th, Palestinians in the diaspora recognize this day as an international day of solidarity. Let's close out this week's African Drumbeat calendar in the language of struggle of our people in South Africa. Amandla.
Awethu.
Amandla.
Awethu.
Amandla.
Awethu. All right.
This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka of Freedom Now.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Mark Ellis, Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, UK, and author of the book Race, War, and Surveillance, African Americans in the United States Government During World War I. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Ellis.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very delighted to have had the invitation, and it's great to be able to join you on the show.
Well, it's great to have you. So why don't you write this book, Race, War, and Surveillance?
It grew out of my doctoral research. When I was at the University of Aberdeen. I originally went to the USA to undertake this research with the intention of learning more about the race riots of 1919. And I was interested in what the US government's response had been. I'd read various reports that the US government had published through congressional hearings about black Bolshevism, and thought that I was really coming to research a project to do with the Red Scare and race riots. But when I started my research in Washington, D.C., after a period of time at Northwestern University, to really sort of immerse myself and do some preparatory work, when I started going into the archives in Washington and looking at the Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner of the FBI, the Bureau of Investigation records and the military intelligence records, from 1919, it became very clear that actually what I was looking at was the continuation of a massive government investigative effort into African American thought and activism, and really the lives and behavior of very ordinary African Americans going about their daily lives and expressing their views about the war, or engaging or not engaging with the draft, beginning in 1917. And so what I thought was a Red Scare investigation was actually the continuation by slightly other means of a wartime investigation into black loyalty, and the very easy transition from the investigation of what was believed to be pro-Germanism among the Negroes, as it was put in the files, and became described in later files as Negro subversion. That was the language that was used during the Red Scare, was really part of the same sort of process of a growing desire to track down the origins of what was believed to be a growing black disloyalty towards the United States, and the consequences of external agitation and an attempt to really foment radicalism and dissent among a population that had previously been perceived, at least by the US government, as essentially docile and compliant. And so it was really, I realized that where I really needed to start, and where the entire project in the end shifted, was towards the wartime question of race and loyalty, and what Woodrow Wilson, of course, termed a war for democracy.
What's interesting is that oftentimes when we consider intense surveillance of the Black community, our attention turns to COINTELPRO, the FBI program of the 1950s.
Yeah.
But your project suggests and demonstrates that this intense surveillance preceded the 1950s. And in that context, talk to us about Walter Loving and Ralph Van Diemen.
Yeah, they're very interesting people who knew each other a bit before the First World War broke out. Walter Loving was, I think, a very remarkable man. He was an African-American soldier, army officer, who had been part of the American forces that occupied the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. He was a musician, very gifted musician, conductor, orchestrator, and he commanded American military bands, African-American military bands, and they performed to a very high standard. And he eventually transferred to the Philippine Constabulary and organized a very highly regarded military band there, and brought them to the United States on a number of occasions to perform at major venues. Van Diemen was an army officer at the time who became aware of Loving, and like most people who encountered him in the army at all ranks, had great respect for Loving as a very efficient officer, who commanded great loyalty among his troops, and was, I think, regarded as an interesting and very competent individual. And when the war broke out, when America entered the war, after 3 or 4 years of belligerency in Europe, the United States declared war in April 1917. It was in the midst of a bit of a spy scare. Wilson and others had created the impression that German Americans were a disloyal element of American society, that they were plotting against the United States in various ways, committing acts of sabotage to prevent the shipping of munitions and other goods to what became America's allies, and fomenting disloyalty, interfering with the draft and the buying of bonds, etc. And one of the aspects of the spy scare of the spring of 1917 was a belief that German agents were targeting the African American population as a sort of American Achilles heel, that you could build on the understandable dissatisfaction of African Americans with many aspects of their lives in the United States, and a rather disdainful, perhaps, attitude on the part of many African Americans towards the idea that America should be fighting a war for democracy when it had its own democratic deficits. And that this German attempt to subvert the loyalty of Black Americans had actually begun to succeed. And there were lots of stories in the American press about disloyalty and German spies and working on to foment racial discord. And Van Diemen had managed to persuade the Army General Staff and the Secretary of War and ultimately the administration that the United States needed to very quickly develop a much more effective military intelligence capacity, and that there was a domestic aspect of it as well, that military intelligence wasn't simply something America would need in the field in France and Belgium, but that there was a domestic intelligence crisis and security crisis as well. And in order to tackle the racial aspect of German plots in America, he needed competent Black advisors, and he remembered Loving, and Loving was keen to return to military service in any case. In some capacity, he wanted to either be able to train troops or advise the government on the training of Black troops. And so he invited Loving to come and work in the new military intelligence branch and in a much expanded organization, which drew on the expertise of all sorts of people. There were mainly civilians who were suddenly put in uniform because of the things they were particularly specialist in. And so this military musician suddenly found himself as an intelligence agent in Washington, D.C., with his own office and in a civil service which was very racially segregated. So he had his own separate office with his own separate secretarial staff, and was given a very free hand to go around the country identifying newspaper editors who were perhaps rather outspoken, and essentially lean on them and persuade them that it would be in their interest and the interest of their readers if they began to sound a bit more patriotic and pro-war, generating groups of speakers, notably Roscoe Conkling Simmons, Booker T. Washington's nephew by marriage, to go around and give patriotic speeches and head off any disloyalty that occurred here and there, and report back to Van Diemen. And Loving's reports were long considered, quite well perceptive and rigorous. And Loving made no bones of the fact that he in normal circumstances, was a very enthusiastic supporter of the NAACP and a very proud standard bearer, really, of a kind of achievement in his race, and agreed with many of the protesting editorials that he no doubt read but disapproved of in the context of the war. So I think he had a challenging time during the war, conflicted really between his own fundamental beliefs, but also a sense of duty to the government and to the army, and to this man Van Diemen, who plucked him from retirement and given him a very significant responsibility during the war. So Loving was a government agent, but a very independent, sort of freewheeling government agent, who was, I think, quite well respected by the people he investigated, and in a very sort of subtle and polite fashion, sort of threatened with the consequences of a prosecution under the Espionage Act and various things like that. So interesting, very interesting man, I think, quite remarkable, and who in more recent sort of decades would have risen, I think, to a very important position.
Now, from the other shore, there was Cyril Briggs, one of the more important Black radicals of the 20th century, who, by the way, passed away in Los Angeles in 1966. Talk to our audience about Cyril Briggs.
You know, Briggs was, like many influential political activists and writers at the time, was an immigrant from the Caribbean. He was heavily involved in a group called the African Blood Brotherhood, and wrote, for other publications, and much of the time, rather than for organs that he was himself able to edit. So he wrote for a number of New York newspapers. He wrote and worked for, I think, Marcus Garvey for a while, although they had a falling out. And so he's very much on the left of the kind of radical left of Black nationalism in this period. A great writer, very perceptive, internationalist in his outlook, and to some extent, recognized the importance of Garvey and Garveyism, and admired aspects of what Garvey did, but didn't like Garvey's style, and the two of them had certain disagreements. I think he was one of those Black writers who, a bit like Du Bois, found Garvey's tendency to attack the people he disagreed with on the basis of their complexion and appearance. And as a light-skinned Black man, I think he was unfairly attacked by Garvey simply for this reason. But I think if you read Briggs's writings, they're very, very fresh and lively, and I think they resonate very well. A bit like Hubert Harrison, very eloquent and persuasive.
There's another Los Angeles connection in your book, Professor Ellis, author of the book Race, War, and Surveillance, and that's the Hollywood blockbuster Birth of a Nation. How does it fit into your narrative?
Well, Birth of a Nation is you could see it to some extent as fomenting a certain kind of white supremacy, and fostering the rebirth of a new version of the Ku Klux Klan in the years after 1915, because of the romanticization of the role of the Klan during Reconstruction, and demonization of the freed slaves and male slaves, the former slaves in particular. Alternatively, you could see it merely as an expression of something that would have happened anyway, that the rebirth of the Klan was growing as a result of, I suppose, the work of Thomas Dixon, the author of The Klansman and the Leopard Spots, the books which inspired D.W. Griffiths to make the film Birth of a Nation. So sometimes I think Birth of a Nation is seen as in the sort of popular shorthand in textbooks as almost cause and effect. The Birth of a Nation whipped up the enthusiasm which led white men in the southern states in particular, but elsewhere in the US, to be drawn to the Klan and join the Klan in huge numbers. But I'm not so sure. I think Birth of a Nation is or the popularity of the film, at least, as an expression of a growing radical form of white supremacy and attitude and nativism that also fuels immigrant restriction, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, the temperance movement, as well, and its enforcement, rejection of the idea that women had additional rights and should have a more important role in American society. It's a whole range of reactionary attitudes that the Klan offers an organizational vehicle for, I think, explain the popularity of the film Birth of a Nation, which film historians recognize as having great importance because of its technical ability, the ability to put together a film on such a large scale and at such length. It was in terms of cinema, it's a breakthrough, but it's also an expression of some deep-seated prejudices and a fundamental fear, I think, as well, of African American progress.
Finally, Professor Mark Ellis, Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, author of the book Race, War, and Surveillance, African Americans in the United States Government During World War I. Talk to us about the Plan de San Diego and how it fits into your book.
This was one of the Plan of San Diego is one of the first apparently convincing plots that the American press, the New York press picked this up pretty quickly, identified in the early weeks of American involvement in the First World War. And I suppose it had a certain amount of plausibility because of the Zimmerman telegram and the sense that the German government was plotting with Mexico to create a massive diversion on the southern border if the United States appeared likely to join the First World War. And this plan alleged that Mexicans and African Americans would unite in a plot to seize the border states, and in some versions of this plan, that a successful attack on the United States would result in some of this territory, perhaps an entire state, New Mexico or Arizona, perhaps, being handed over to black people to govern as a separate state, a home for them in interior Liberia almost, as a reward for helping a border war to break out and occupy American troops in the United States rather than in Europe. It was a conflation of a whole series of rumors and a lot of speculation, and an expression of the kind of hysteria that accompanied the war, and the degree of tension, I think, along the border, which had been fueled by raids by Mexican groups, and of course the Pancho Villa in particular, who General Pershing, who later became the American commander in Europe, had spent a great deal of time trying to suppress.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Mark Ellis, Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, UK, author of the book Race, War and Surveillance, African Americans in the United States Government During World War I. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles, Professor Ellis.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
And up next, our prison radio commentary with Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Voting one's rage. As of now, the nation's midterm elections are not yet over. But this much is clear. One major political party, shall we call it the Trump Party, suffered from a massive miscalculation. For months, they all but threatened a great red wave, if not a tsunami. What happened was neither red nor truly blue. It was pink. For the elections bore proof of a largely silent presence in American politics, that of women. No polls captured their mass discontent, but this pink flood was unleashed by the summer 2022 release of the Dodd decision, which threw out the precedent of Roe v. Wade. This pink flood was sent out into the voting booths of America because of the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, doing something it has rarely done, taking away a constitutional right that had stood for over half a century. Women quietly and effectively punished the Trumpists, who defended the Dodd decision and sent many of them packing. They understood intuitively that politicians, especially male politicians, were poor judges of when or whether a woman should choose when to give birth. Americans are a funny bunch. They take a great deal of guff from their political leaders. But when their rights are stolen, another side emerges. Women marched straight to the polls and pulled a rabbit out of the hat. They refuted history by making a new history. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu-Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
This is Nakima Hill, 270530 at the Huron Valley Prison for Women. And my title is Outraged. I've been going through some changes medically, and right now I see a red dot. You can't see it physically, but I can see it looking at you. It's like on my left side, it's orange when I look out. So I've been back and forth to the hospital. They gave me glasses, and I went to the optometrist who made my eyes dilate, and so now I'm wearing some glasses. So also I have a wheelchair detail from me breaking my neck. So I just tried to go eat. This lady who always messing with me named Miss Myers stopped me as I'm getting in a wheelchair. Now she herself gave me my wheelchair detail. So she gonna tell me that I couldn't go to child, that I had to have it on my person, but going to the hospital, you have to take everything out your pocket. You can't take anything. So I just let this lady know I came from the hospital. I'm ill. I'm sick. I can't even see, and I'm blind, and I'm dizzy. This lady want to argue with me, so I try to ask the next officer. I can't even read her name. Can she be the voice of reason? She gonna tell me. Well, she told the other officer, did she have the nerve to ask me something that you just asked her? I said, yeah, because we need somebody to be the voice of reason. So I said, you gonna roll with her? Okay, don't worry about it. I got something for that too. So I've been denied a child, and I just don't understand how these people can keep going through this and keep doing us that way. Like create a hostile environment. Now how my attitude is, I could have easily went and said, I'm tired of this. And I'm tired of them telling us to go ahead and grieve because they know the grievances get thrown away. I'm sick of this. When are we going to get some help, some justice? Because we need it. I am physically unable to do anything right now.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Robin Binckes, a writer from South Africa and the author of the book Vlakplaas, Apartheid Death Squads, 1979 to 1994. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Robin Binckes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book, and why is Vlakplaas in the title?
I wrote the book as a result of having written a couple of history books on what would be called colonial history, which is the early years of the Voortrekkers, and I was then commissioned by a publishing company in England called Pen and Sword, who were compiling a series of books under the title of History of Terror. There were two series that they were doing, and the one was History of Terror, and they invited me to write two books, one being on the death squads in South Africa, and the other being on an event known as the Mfecane, which affected the Zulu nation some years before. So I didn't initiate the book, I was actually asked to write it by Pen and Sword.
Mm-hmm.
Reason for the title of Vlakplaas is that I was introduced to Vlakplaas by a man called Jacques Poe, who's a very well-known South African author, and who's also written a lot of books about that era of the death squads. And I was taken to Vlakplaas and was fascinated by the place, and then together with Jacques Poe's input, I began my own research into what had transpired. And when one looked at the theme of the death squads, the focal point was Vlakplaas, and many of the atrocities that were committed emanated from Vlakplaas, and many of them actually took place at Vlakplaas. So I felt that the title was appropriate. And for your listeners, I should explain that Vlakplaas is a farm which was purchased by the South African police force as a base for the police to bring captured Askaris. And an Askari was a soldier fighting against the South African Defence Forces, either as what was termed as a terrorist or as an activist in some form, and to bring them to the farm and to attempt to turn them so that they would then work for the South African government against their own people. That was the objective of Vlakplaas and the people who worked there. And in many instances, they were successful. In others, they eliminated their victims at Vlakplaas or from Vlakplaas.
So this book is discussing at length the attempts of the apartheid regime in Pretoria to hold on to power before the first democratic elections in 1994. And a pivotal role in your pages is played by operatives from the United States. For example, you mentioned that when Nelson Mandela was detained in the early 1960s, serving a 27-year-plus prison term, that a U.S. CIA operative by the name of Donald Rickert was instrumental in that detention. And subsequently, you talk about the United States helping the Pretoria apartheid regime to train, which you refer to as, quote, anti-Castro Cubans and other U.S. nationals. Could you elaborate upon that topic of the role of the United States in your pages?
Yes, I'll start off with Nelson Mandela. As you raised that particular incident, Nelson Mandela had been called back from a fundraising drive for the armed wing of the African National Congress and the Communist Party in Mkhonto and he was raising funds to help finance the struggle against the apartheid regime. He was called back by the head of the ANC at that time, Chief Albert Luthuli, and he went down to meet with him in Durban, which he did for some time. I think it was a period of about a week. And on the way back to Johannesburg, he was stopped in a police roadblock near a little town called Howick. And the policeman, in fact, told him that they were arresting him for leaving the country illegally and inciting an illegal strike. Mandela's response was that they had the wrong man because Mandela had taken on the police, one would assume, burst out laughing because they knew exactly who Nelson Mandela was, and they had been tipped off by Donald Rickert, who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. And I should enlarge on that because you'd say, well, why should the CIA be involved? Well, at that time, South Africa was really a mirror of what was happening in the Western world, in that, for example, in your own country in the 50s, you had McCarthyism, where people were being accused of being communists, and in the 60s you had the Korean War against the communists, and in the 70s you had the Vietnam War, where America fought again against the communists, and we were told the communists are coming here. We were rich and still are in mineral resources, and we were told the communists are coming to take control. And there was this paranoia if you like, about communism in South Africa. And the government jumped on the bandwagon and exploited it to the maximum effect, that everything was linked back to communism. I, as a young man, was in the Defense Force, excuse me, in 1960, and we actually believed, despite the obvious incorrectness of our thinking, that we were the good guys. We were fighting the evil of communism. And so, because of South Africa being a strong ally in the fight against communism, they found a very obliging bedfellow in the form of the United States.
Now, you also talk about Wouter Basson, known on these shores as Dr. Death, who used toxins to kill ANC militants. He had a comrade in Irvine, California, who collaborated with Dr. Death, except that he used toxins against old flames. Talk to us about Dr. Death.
Well, Dr. Death, or Wouter Basson, was involved in the murders of many terrorists, but terrorists as we call them, freedom fighters as we now call them, and used his medical skills and knowledge for the preparation of drugs and other instruments of death to carry out his work. I'm not familiar with his colleague in America that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Now, we also know that the apartheid regime in Pretoria sent millions of US dollars to press organs in Washington, DC, and Sacramento, California. Talk to us about their propaganda offensive, particularly in the United States.
Yes, well, we had a man called Eshel Rudy, who was the head of the Department of Information, who carried out a number of operations to propagate the policies, if you like, of the apartheid government, locally and internationally. For example, the government funded locally a newspaper here called The Citizen, secretly, of course, which was a pro-government organ. And then it launched a magazine called To the Point, which was also a propaganda publication, secretly funded by the Department of Information. And it actually assisted publisher McGough to buy the Washington Star. But that attempt failed. They provided $10 million to help. And McGough then purchased the Sacramento Union for Eshel Rudy, this gentleman who headed up the information department. He also established advertising agencies internationally to create advertising programs to put a positive spin on the apartheid story. And of course, there was the normal conventional methods of propaganda of paid adverts in the UK and in places like the New York Times and Washington Post, Montreal Star, and wherever they were able to use South African funds to bolster the propaganda story in the States, this was done. All, of course, secretly, without the knowledge of South African public.
You also talk about the tragic death of Mozambican leader Samora Machel, who in 1986 died in a mysterious plane crash. What was suspicious about this plane crash? And are there any new revelations that have emerged of late about the death of Samora Machel?
Well, I'll take the last part first. The answer is no. There have not been, to my knowledge, any additional information about the death of Samora Machel. But in my book, I talk about the death, in fact, of two heads of states, the one being Samora Machel and the other being Olive Palmer. And I'll come back to Olive Palmer after I've answered your question about Samora Machel. Samora Machel was on his way back from a meeting in Zambia in an aircraft which was piloted by Russian pilots and was flying back to Mozambique, to Maputo, after the meeting concluded. And Samora Machel, just again or Mozambique, should I say, was seen very much as an ally of the liberation struggle. And Samora Machel, in fact, had believed that the government of South Africa would try to kill him. And on the day that he departed, he held a press conference and, in fact, informed the press to that effect. After his meeting in Zambia, he departed for Maputo. It was late afternoon, early evening, and the aircraft mysteriously turned and flew into a range of mountains, killing all on board. There were a number of events that would indicate that the South African security forces were deeply involved. And when writing this book, I met with the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pik Botha, because I was convinced that he knew what had happened. And the speculation is, and it's never been proved, unfortunately, is that the security forces put out the VOR beacons, which are the approach beacons that aircraft use to identify the airport and assist them in landing. They managed to infiltrate the staff at Maputo Airport and the beacon in Swaziland, which is right nearby, because where the accident happened was in a triangle between Swaziland, Mozambique, and South Africa. And they put the two correct beacons out of commission and erected a rogue beacon, if you like, right in the middle of the mountains range, which led to the aircraft assuming that they were landing at Maputo airfield when in fact they were descending into a mountain range. There are signed affidavits to the effect that the beacon was built for this purpose. The Margot Commission, which went into the investigation of the death of Samora Machel and the accident, came up with a verdict that there had been no interference on the part of the South African security forces, and that Marco himself has a right-wing and military background with the South African Defence Force. So his judgment is rather suspect. But Botha himself, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, refused to discuss it, and actually his response was, when I challenged him and asked him whether he had been in the vicinity the night before, which it was rumored that he had, together with other leaders of the security forces, his exact words were, "That is a damned lie," and refused to discuss it any further. Unfortunately, that has never been proved. The other one was the death of Olive Palmer, the assassination of Olive Palmer, which was for many years speculated that it was the South African security forces, and the head of the place called Vlakplaas actually gave evidence at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that, in fact, a man called Craig Williamson, who was known in South Africa as Super Spy, had been involved in the assassination of Olive Palmer. However, again, there was after many years, there has been a investigation led by a Swedish prosecutor who actually, his name is Christian Peterson, and he came up with a finding that there was a great deal of evidence that would indicate a man called Stig Engström, who's known as the Scandia man, and that South Africa wasn't involved in the assassination. Rather strangely, he made that announcement on the 10th of June of 2020, subsequent to me writing the book, and Mr. Stig Engström committed suicide 16 days later and passed away. But the prosecutor actually said he did not have sufficient evidence to charge him, but he felt he had sufficient evidence to publicly blame him. So that is rather questionable.
Well, Mr. Binckes, author of Vlakplaas, Apartheid Death Squads, 1979 to 1994. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but I should mention as a footnote that on that plane crash with Samora Machel was his deputy foreign minister, Jose Carlos Lobo, who happened to have attended California State University in Long Beach. In any case, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles, Robin Binckes.
Thank you, Dr. Horne.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Mark Ellis and Robin Binckes. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Brother Brandon, Sister Femi, and all those who made today's program possible. Stay tuned for our Sister Assumpta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. This is Sister Thage signing off for Freedom Now. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.